Great. Okay. So welcome everybody to our third session on the school to work transition. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I'm Christine Valenza-Shin. I'm an alumna. I'm class of '84, and I'm the Senior Associate Director for our Advising and Programs team here at Beyond Barnard. And it's my pleasure to lead this session today and hear a little bit from you about what's happening as you continue to search for your first job after Barnard. Some of you may have already started your first job, and some of you might be in between. You have an offer, but it has been postponed and you haven't quite gotten started yet. So, so welcome everybody, and we'll jump right in. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, great. So some of what I just told you is right there. This is part of our Managing the School to Work transition, and today we're focusing on workplace etiquette and effective communication. So we'll go ahead and get started. And I'm probably not going to actively be looking at the chat until I reach a stopping point. So, but feel free to add any questions as we go along, and I'll get to them at the end. So this is part of the Beyond Barnard Summer Colloquium. We are kicking off week 6. Yes, this is week 6 of 8 weeks of programming. It's been a very full summer, and I know a lot of you have been taking part in a number of these. Some of you, it might be your first session. So whether you're returning or coming for the first time, everyone's welcome. And like our boss, AJ Ehrenstein, I like to start with a summer-related mental health pause. It's actually more of a reminder to me than anybody else to take a deep breath as we head into the presentation and head into talking about what can be stressful topics at times. And just remember to take that mental break to go outside or look at a picture or meditate or whatever it is you do to sort of take that little mental break. We'll talk a little bit about that more at the end when we talk about some of the stress of starting your first job. So this is the third in a 4-part series. Some of you may have joined us 2 weeks ago for Defining Professional Success. We had a panel of alumni talking about the different ways they had navigated success and adapting to the workplace and managing that transition. And then last week, my colleague Brianna Roman talked about starting remotely, working remotely. Today, as I mentioned, we'll focus on workplace etiquette and effective communication. And then next week, my colleague Lindsay Granger-Weaver, who's also been managing this whole series, will present on advocating for yourself and workplace rights, a really important topic and helpful to know. It's a whole new world that you're entering into, and it's good to get the lay of the land. So that's the plan. And if you missed either of the previous 2 sessions, they are recorded, and you can find the PowerPoints on our resources section and the recording of the session on our YouTube channel. Sometimes takes, we work on a 7 to 10 day schedule after in terms of posting the videos, because they need a little bit of editing. So it might not be up right away, but you should be able to circle back. Okay, so great. So some of the things it's a big topic. We could probably talk for a long time about all the different details of etiquette and communication, because there's so much variety in what you all will encounter. But we're going to just take a look at a couple of key topics, and I want to leave as much time as possible for both a couple of scenarios. I want to hear some from you, as well as potential solutions, and then I've got a couple that I've outlined myself as well. So, so we're going to take a look at these different topics relatively quickly, and then duck out. But first, it would be helpful. I'm going to exit full screen for, oops, sorry. I have this very sensitive mouse when it comes to screen sharing, so it tends to jump ahead faster than I want and then stop for a moment. Okay. All right, so actually, I'm going to just go ahead through the slides and then we'll stop and talk after about 15 minutes or so. So we're going to take a look first at new job mindset and developing a professional persona. So one of the things when we talk about this topic is that we sometimes state the obvious, but sometimes stating the obvious is really important. And so one of the first things we talk to about anybody starting a new job is that it's okay to focus initially on learning to do your job well. And particularly when you're starting your first full-time or professional job after graduating college, you're really navigating a whole new world. Now, a lot of you might have had most of you have had some other experience. You have had a variety of jobs, a variety of internships, perhaps, that have given you a preview of some of this. But it's quite a change from having been in school for as many years as you have, and having been as successful at school as all of you have been, to making this transition and figuring out this new set of rules, this new set of expectations. And one thing, that can be helpful as you're making this transition is to keep an eye out for the differences between school and work. And one of the biggest parts of it is, you learn to do the student work very well and to be very successful at a challenging high school in many cases, and certainly college. And now you're in a new situation. And one thing that's helpful is to think about what the overall goal is. So the overall goal of schooling is to educate you. The goal of the school is to educate its students collectively. The goal of work, the goal of the organization is to get the work done well, fulfill the mission of that organization, whether it's a nonprofit or for-profit, and you are one part of that. And so you need to learn your part of it, and learn to do your new job well. But at the same time, that can be quite challenging, but you also need to not put too much, you need to expect a lot, but you don't have to know everything at once. So, the word observing is used a lot. And so keeping your eyes open, listening carefully, watching carefully, observing how things operate, and then asking questions, really important. Not constant questions, but, and often a really good technique is to save up the questions, so jot them down as you go along and then ask them. It could be of your manager, it could be of one of your colleagues who does similar work to you, and then, go ahead and ask them. But that's probably, when we get to some of the scenarios, both that you share and I share, that's often the first step, is to ask questions. And there's a lot of advice around mistakes. But, and part of that is simply acknowledging that there are going to be mistakes, big and little. Some of them you'll be involved with, some of them will be other people's mistakes, but you want to observe that when you're in the middle of it, it's sometimes hard to do, but you want to take that moment afterwards and reflect on what went wrong, why did it go wrong, what was your part in it, what can you do differently. And again, you don't have to do this in isolation. You can do this through talking as well. There's also some logistics here when you're entering a new job. And so you want to make sure that you understand whether there is a formal or informal probation period. Is there a specific detailed training period? Is it less formal than that? Is there a formal, sometimes there's a 3-month period in which you're considered to be on probation in sort of an informal way. And then at the end of that, you'll have a conversation with your manager and, for the most part, be moved on. But sometimes if, moved on to, staying in the job and continuing to work. If you've got a good manager and a well-run organization, if there are problems during the probation period, they'll bring them to your attention, but you can do the same as well. If you're really feeling like you're floundering or not getting the support and training you need, you also want to not wait too long. It's okay to bring that up in this sort of first 3 to 6 month period that is often common, even if it's informal. And training's important. Sometimes it is done very formally. There's a whole process of welcoming a group of new people into a job. And sometimes if you're the only one joining, or there's only a handful of you, or you're in different sections, there might not be a formal training period, but most of the training will take place on sort of a day-to-day basis. But you want to find out, are there resources? Are there manuals? Are there workshops? Are there online tutorials to teach you different pieces of the job. So it's a great thing to ask at HR, to ask your manager. And then in terms of the larger professional development, often refers to that ongoing learning, right? So you're professionally developing in your job itself, but there can also be outside resources in terms of, you know, looking longer term, what skills you need to thrive, not only in your current job, but in the field in general and in other fields. So you want to ask about those things, and that can sometimes be part of your benefits package. So be aware of that as well. We'll circle back on some specifics on that when we talk a little bit about networking. And then the other part of this is developing your professional persona. So again, you've had years and years to develop your student persona, who you are as a student. And so now there's a time to think about, it's time to think whether you've started a job, you know, recently, or you're still in search and anticipating starting the job. Who do you want to be at work? So there's a couple suggestions here. I would sort of do both, you know, think about from the work you've done, both academically and then in jobs and in internships, you know, what are your strongest professional attributes? You might have talked about these already in a cover letter or an interview, but think genuinely about what strengths you bring to this, and how can you show those, and how can you make sure people are aware of those? Not on a constant basis, but if you've got strong points, you want to display them. So if that means, you know, volunteering to take on a project that you are familiar with, or you know you have a good skill set for, then that could be an opportunity. And then if you have an opportunity, you might have a weekly check-in with a supervisor, or a little less frequently. This is, you know, it's a good time at the end of that sort of scheduled thing to save time at the end, you know, to ask a question about what else you could be doing, or even to point out, it could be as simple as saying, oh, you know, I had a chance to work with, you know, Maria on this, and I really enjoyed doing that, and I learned this from her, you know. So, you know, talking about yourself a little bit more. It's, again, not constant, but there's also a fair amount of literature that suggests that women in particular don't do this enough at work, and don't do this enough sort of early on in their careers. And part of that comes out from that school mindset, where it's, you do your work and you get a grade, and that's how people know whether you've done a good job or not. In the workplace, there isn't that system, and you may not always, you know, get that automatic feedback. Sometimes you have to be proactive and either ask for the feedback or share your own feedback about what you did well and what you're thinking about doing differently. So, and then part of this professional persona is just this work you, is figuring out what kind of work you need to have to fit in with your industries and organizations' norms. So, you know, we all have multiple versions of ourselves, but to be really simplistic about it, you have sort of your whole self, your true self, and then your work self. And your work self is partially determined, obviously, by who you are and what you bring to it, as we said, but it's also how you learn to behave can be influenced by the norms within your company, within your team, within your industry. And so, you know, taking some time, again, we're back to observing, you know, thinking about that and figuring out, you know, where is that stretching you? Where does it feel comfortable? Where does it rub up against things that aren't comfortable for you, either for philosophical or even moral reasons, or is it just that you're learning and you're not used to it? So, you know, taking that time to think about that, talk about it a little bit, you know, talk about it with your peers, or with one of us here at Beyond Barnard, with mentors, you know, what's coming hard to you, what's coming more easily to you. And then this idea, this concept of a professional persona, that there's a work you and an other you, can also help with something that can be challenging, which is setting boundaries and maintaining professional relationships, which is part of what you're trying to navigate here. So, you know, what's appropriate outside of work, what's appropriate inside of work, and sort of navigating that process as well. So then we'll come to a somewhat loaded term, dress for success. I think this kind of came out in the 80s, especially as women were entering the workforce in much larger numbers. Women had always been there, but expanded greatly in the 80s and has continued to do so. And so there's this whole concept of, you know, the male uniform for success, what's the female uniform? And that's come to be quite a complex thing as it's evolved over the decades, because of course now there's not a single uniform, even per industry, there's all sorts of different norms. So the dress codes, and we're talking mostly about informal codes, although there can also be formal dress codes depending on your office and your organization. They really do change from office to office and industry to industry. So for those of you who are still interviewing, still in the process of looking for a job, it's something to keep an eye on as you interview. But then as you know, and the general rule of thumb for interviewing is to sort of to dress one step ahead of what's normal day to day, you know. So if normal day to day is jeans and sweatshirts, you don't want to jump up necessarily to wearing a formal suit to an interview, but you would aim for a more business casual in between type of thing. So that's sort of the rule of thumb. Once you start, there's a range of options. You want to observe and you want to make your choices. You know, some people will start on the more formal, more polished, more professional looking side. It helps to make them feel older or more competent or more serious. You know, other people will gladly just go with the norm, and you know, and that can often be the smartest thing to do, you know, to just sort of fit in. So, and of course, as you know, Brianna talked about last week, this is complicated at the moment by the fact that people are working from home. And so you'll still, you know, I think overall, the trend in the last 6 months has been for dress codes to be a lot less formal. People are working from home. There's more interest in sort of comfortable clothing, but you'll still see variations around this. And if you're unsure, most people are dressing a certain way, but your manager dresses more formally, you know, or vice versa. You can ask about that. You don't need to just operate blindly. Some of this, I think this second bullet is more relevant to, again, you know, when we're working in person, but it can be quite a budget strain, you know, to build a new wardrobe. Again, hopefully a little bit easier to do in the age of remote work if you are working remotely, but you don't want to, you know, go crazy spending tons of money you don't yet have on clothing. So, you know, choose wisely. Some of the advice out there is to, you know, get a couple, you know, spend a little bit more money if you've got the opportunity on some pieces that are high quality and will last longer, and then fill in around that and sort of gradually add to the repertoire. And again, it's so hard to talk about all of this in the current environment that's where so many people are working from home. But, you know, again, thinking about the fact that, you know, most of us are only visible from the shoulders up. So maybe the jewelry matters more. And, you know, there's other little ways to do things to look more formal on some days and informal on other days. So, and it's okay to talk about this. And especially if you have, some of you have developed mentoring relationships with alumni or who have, you know, you had a sort of general conversation with them. It's not a bad time to circle back and say, hey, I just started my job and I have a couple of questions that might seem kind of small, but they're bugging me, you know. And so sometimes asking people outside of your direct organization, but within the industry, can give you some perspective on what they've done. And then in specific, that's talking, you know, sometimes where there is a dress code around things like piercings or norms around hair coloring, etc. You know, it's sometimes helpful to talk to people who've navigated that and find out what choices they've made. So. Okay. See if this will turn for me. Here's where we get to. Great. Okay. So then another thing we just wanted to touch on in terms of etiquette and this, you know, sort of whole process of starting a job is networking as a new professional. So part of your network and part of your network for years to come will be people that you currently work with and people that you used to work with. And so that's where you want to look at this context, is both as you start, how can you make connections? Obviously, you're going to more immediately make connections within your team and your department, but then how can you be making connections more broadly, getting a broader sense of who's out there and how the work is all fitting together, right? So always you want to make that good first impression. And so, basic things like being on time, but also really important things like the energy you bring to work, feeling, presenting positively, even if you're feeling anxiety or stress or, other more negative factors, trying to be authentic, but the sort of best version of yourself, especially in the beginning. There's a number of ways to build relationships in the workplace. Again, some of this is going to be more challenging in a virtual environment, but lots of workplaces are doing all sorts of things to sort of keep not only that work connection, but some of the social connections together. So find out. Very often when somebody starts, sometimes, again, if you're joining with a group of recent grads, sort of in a group, there's going to be a lot more structured things, but generally a lot of workplaces will have both formal and informal, opportunities to meet the team, so you want to take advantage of that and then circle back. If it's okay for you to take the initiative, for instance, if you, see in the first week or so that there's some key people that you're going to be working with either on the team or in other offices that obviously have a tight connection to what you're doing, it might be a great thing to ask for is a quick one-on-one with those people, schedule a 15 to 20 minute Zoom conference and with the basic agenda of tell me about what you do, tell me about what your role entails and where does it connect with mine and what advice can you give me or what information can you give me about making it smoothly. Very often a manager or colleagues will, again, in a non-COVID world, would invite you out to lunch. You may get a virtual version of that. You want to take people up on that invite, within reason, and take that opportunity to get to know people in a slightly less formal setting. Okay. This final point about ways that make you feel comfortable, yourselves, and you'll be sort of learning a lot more about yourselves as you start this transition. You don't have to say yes to everything. You don't have to socialize with everybody outside of work. Again, you want to get a sense for how frequent that is, what the norms are around that, and those norms may be suspended during this time. But you can take a break. You can keep things short. You don't have to go to everything. And then on the more formal side, having some of those sit downs, where you do talk to your manager, set aside some time to talk to your manager about how things are going. It might be at the 2-week point, the 1-month point, leaving space in those conversations. If you have a regularly scheduled thing to talk, not just about the day to day, but a little bit big picture, how are things going? What should I be anticipating for the next couple of months? What's coming up? What would you like to see me do differently? What would you like to see me, initiating some of those feedback conversations can be helpful. And then one thing that we hear a lot from our alumni when we're doing advising and they participate in programs is that sometimes you work for a place or for a person who doesn't do regular meetings, and that can be really difficult as well. And so taking that initiative to set up a more regular time to meet with your manager and others can be really helpful too. And this last point, so much of this is so much of the kind of challenge of navigating this is that there's a two-way street here, but there are power dynamics, right? So acting professionally and, not getting drawn into things that might be viewed as unprofessionally, like sitting around gossiping or excessive complaining, things that make you a little uncomfortable because you're not sure of the dynamics or you're not having that experience, you just got here. You can push back on some of that. You don't have to just be drawn into it just because someone's been there longer than you or is higher up than you, but it's not always simple. Which is why we're going to look at some different scenarios and also hear some of what you're finding in terms of challenges. So, and then don't forget that in the long term, you also, not in both the short term and long term, you want to also be looking at building your network outside of work. It could be if you're, feeling pretty clear that this is the field for you and this is something you want to be working on long term, you can look within your industry, but even outside of that, it can be very helpful in sort of the exploratory process and that long term of like, where, you know, I'm doing this for now, where do I want to end up? Look at opportunities outside of work. So there's a whole world. Some of you might have been exposed to this already, some not. There's a whole world of conferences and events. Most of this has been virtual recently, but those are great to take advantage of as well. And sometimes you'll be invited as part of work, but a lot of these go on sort of outside of work in the sense that a lot of your colleagues might belong to them, but they're not actively talking about it every day. So you want to take a look, you can ask people, you can do some Google research, you can look at on LinkedIn at what type of groups and organizations your colleagues belong to. Check into them. Sometimes there is a student rate, which if you haven't started work yet, you might still qualify for. If you have just started, there could be a new member rate. So there's often a fee associated with these, but it can be a very good investment. But it's a really helpful thing to sort of ask. There can be multiple organizations. And so one of the things you're looking for either through research on LinkedIn or simply by asking people is what is the maybe one or two dominant organizations for a particular field? And you know, what do people belong to and what's valuable? And then of course we've encouraged you all the time while you were undergrads and as you've graduated to connect with Barnard alumni, but it's a very strong network. There are Facebook groups, there are LinkedIn groups, there are obviously all sorts of programs and events back on campus in normal times and virtual at, you know, especially now, but in general, where you can connect with fellow recent alumni, with older alumni. So keep an eye on. And then there's also regional groups. So depending on where you're at, you know, there's usually a Barnard presence. And then, you know, through also, there's LinkedIn specifically sort of dominates the professional social media. It's not really dominates, but it's like, it's sort of the go-to, but then there are, you know, a lot of groups as well on whether it's Instagram or Facebook or other different outlets. You can look for both formal and informal groups or what's sometimes referred to as thought leaders, people you can follow to sort of keep up with what's going on and build that network. And then listservs are are basically closed email groups that you have to be invited in, but they are still, can be a pretty common tool in some industries. And so it's definitely worth asking people about. It's a good networking question to ask both of current colleagues and as you do some of this other outside networking. Okay, I'm gonna hurry things up just a little so we have plenty of time for questions. Communication, we could probably do a whole series just on communication and the various ins and outs of learning how to communicate professionally, but let's try and hit on a couple of things. So it's interesting in doing some research for this presentation, I sort of fell into the internet hole. There's a lot of advice around emailing and emailing norms, but one of the biggest complaints is that kids today, students today don't read their emails, aren't used to email as a primary form of communication. And it's true that in some industries, some organizations that email, especially where the workforce is relatively young, that emails might not be as central as they are in other places, but it's definitely something email is still sort of the communication of record for a lot of places in terms of, it could be within your team, it could be within the organization. I know even at Barnard, there's a big push to, that it is the single way to communicate with everyone. So when something has to be communicated to all staff, all faculty, all students, that official information comes in an email, and that can be true on a lower level within your organization. So you do, if you haven't up till now relied on email, you need to, it's likely to play a more central role than it might have in school. So your part of this, obviously part of it is the reading part of it, but the writing part we're going to focus on a little bit. And if you can do those three things, succinct, direct, and polite, you're a long way. All right. Polite doesn't mean in an excessive thank you and you're welcome and all this. Just be diplomatic, be, don't be rude, the opposite of polite. One of my favorite things, and it took me a while to learn this because a lot. I write at length. And I'll still do this sometimes in an email. I'll be giving all the background and context, and then I have to say to myself, stop. What's the main question? What's the main issue? What's the thing I need approval for? Put that right at the top, and then give the context. So just boiling it down, it's journalistic. It's like, don't bury the lead. The lead is, I have a question about this. I can't do this until you approve this. I think this is the way to go, but let me know if, if I'm wrong. You want to lead with that, and then you can give the background if needed. Right? The tone thing is interesting. When you're first reaching out to somebody, you want to use some of those softening, hope this email finds you well, especially if you're asking somebody for something. But once you get and especially if you're communicating with someone higher up. So I remember the first time I had to write an email directly to Deborah Spar, the former Burnout president. It took me like I'd been emailing for years and never gave a second thought, but somehow I'm like, I'm directly, and I had had very little personal interaction with her. So it was like, it stressed me out to be going straight to the top. So when you are sort of communicating upwards, you're going to be a little bit, less familiar, right? But one thing that you'll figure out is how your manager prefers to communicate, how your colleagues prefer to communicate. And some, people who've been there a while have a certain style, and you can reflect that style back. You don't have to, but, so some people are super terse. One of my earliest bosses at Barnard communicated through subject line only. She didn't even write an email. She just would put her question in the subject line. And then I could never do that. I could never answer back in the subject line, but I learned very quickly with her to write just a sentence or two, and it didn't need a dear, it didn't need a sign off. It was just boom, straight to the point. But you'd never do that the first time. That sort of evolves. And then if you have a conflict, if there's a problem, we'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, but that it can be very difficult through email. Like sometimes if there's a conflict or you're straightening something out, you want it in writing because you want that trail. But there's other times, especially when you're feeling particularly emotional or it's a particularly complex or fraught problem, that picking up the phone is going to be easier, and having that sort of off the record conversation, let's talk this through, face to face, over Zoom or talk directly over the phone, or if you had the in-person option, let's talk about it directly. It's easier to do that. And then you still can write afterwards and say, as discussed, we've decided to do X, so you can summarize it in an email. But if you find yourself sort of going on and rewriting and rephrasing in email, sometimes it is easier to just talk directly. And then there are periods, I did a little informal poll of my team and some of my other colleagues this morning. There's very strong feelings about sign-offs. Our boss, one of our bosses, AJ Ehrenstein, Dean, hates best, best, comma, your name. I do that all the time. A lot of my colleagues do it. Other people use cheers. Other people use thanks, so people have strong feelings. I suppose it's worth finding out if your boss has super strong feelings about that. I can't imagine it's going to sink or swim, but, and again, very often the style, once you get started going back and forth with someone, is that you leave off the greeting, you leave off the sign off, and you just get to the heart of the matter. So, Lindsay Granger Weaver, who I mentioned earlier, shared this with me. I particularly like this. She saw it on Instagram. It was in high circulation, she said, a year ago. I was looking at on Instagram at Danny Donovan, a lot of infographics like this about, she seems to have a particular interest in ADHD, managing life, managing work. So I thought that was interesting. But take a look at some of these yes and no's. And in a minute, when I stop talking, we can talk through some of them if you have any questions about it. So I think the trend here, if we look at these 9 suggestions, is more proactive, less apologetic. and the whole concept of emailing like a boss is that somebody who's a boss who is more comfortable and confident in people doing what they say can be something to emulate as opposed to being not the boss. So taking out the sorries, the questions, the justs and the hopefullys, and being a little more direct and more proactive. I particularly like I think a good example is that one down at the bottom, I have an appointment. You're not asking for permission, you're saying, I have an appointment, I'm letting you know that I need to leave. It still leaves room for them to say, oh, that's terrible timing. Is there any way you can rearrange that, in which case you can say either yes or no, depending on how urgent the appointment is for you or how difficult it would be to reschedule. But you are entitled to, not every day, but you are entitled to have other things going on outside of work that take you away. You may need to use your medical leave or your paid time off for that, but generally speaking, they should be able to accommodate an appointment, especially with advance notice. So. And again, I'm happy to field questions about these in a minute. Okay. Always a few words about social media. LinkedIn is the sort of go-to place to officially connect with somebody professionally. You don't have to rush out and connect to all of your colleagues the minute you start, but certainly as you navigate the first couple of months and as you start to connect with people, and enjoy working with them, you could sort of start with them, and connect there as well. It's a fairly normal thing to do, is to connect with your colleagues. Right. And in some of these other media where you can have more than one account, the advice is it's really easy to blur the lines, and it's not just on you. There are places that use social media that are social media is sort of central to the mission. Fields like media, everybody lives on Twitter, and so everyone's on Twitter. But what a lot of people do is, they have two separate Twitters. They have their professional Twitter, their personal Twitter, and they make that distinction. Same thing you can do on Facebook and Instagram. You can sort of separate. You don't have to, but it's something to think about. It can get messy, especially if you end up being, say, friends on Facebook with colleagues, and then later maybe one of those people becomes your supervisor or you become their supervisor. Then you get into sort of tricky territory. So something to think about. Cannot emphasize the no negativity strongly enough. You need to be really careful of this. One of our advisors had a friend who, was in a chat group that, and was complaining about their boss, and their boss accidentally got looped in, and it was a huge, huge thing. So you just want to be really, again, that's an argument for separation. If you're going to, if you need to vent, if you're getting advice from your social circle about job stress, about job problems, you don't want that to overlap. You don't want to have a written social media record. People can screen share it. People can forward email. You never know where it's going to end up. Okay, just a few more quick points, and then we'll chat. Oh, I get stuck again. Sorry, if that's sensitive. Great. Okay, just a few words about burnout. I think Brianna talked a little bit about self-care last week. Lindsay will talk about it a little in the context of advocating for yourself, but it can be, we're all living under a time of really high stress because of COVID, because of economic issues, because of a difficult job search, a difficult work environment. But you add on to that the stress of starting something new, like your first job out of college, and you can end up feeling burned out and really stressed out. And this tends to come on gradually. You're not necessarily going to recognize it, but it is something that is common for new professionals, and it's something to keep your eye on. And some tips for that. So when you become aware of, I really like that pervasive feeling, I can't, it's starting to be hard to do things in real life, hard to do things in your professional space, feeling very discouraged, feeling unmotivated, to recognize and acknowledge that, figure out where is this coming from? Where's the stress coming from? Are there things that I can do? Can I talk to my manager about this, about saying no, or about how to how to prioritize things? Can I do some things for myself? And again, working from home has been interesting. I think that it has given some people a little bit more flexibility, in terms of being able to take some breaks, take a walk, because you're home. You can sort of do things a little bit sometimes more easily than you can when you're physically working somewhere. But think about your routines. Can you do things that will break the day up, give you stress relief? Can you take a day off? And then if it's not resolving quickly, talk to your personal support system, whatever, friends, family, whoever's there, including professionals, and I would put, somewhere in between there, you can also talk to us, right? So, beyond Barnard, we give career advice, but part of the career advice we give is managing the work, and managing your own professional development and where that's going. Right. And so then, let's do a couple of scenarios. I'm going to stop screen sharing so that I can look in the chat. Okay. So, yeah. So I've been talking, all right, a lot. So let's give you a chance to talk. You are welcome to unmute and jump in. Or you can type your question or scenario, but let's talk about a couple of specific examples of this. We've sort of been talking big picture. What's a scenario that you have been, well, first of all, actually, let me hear from some of you. We've got how many people in the room? We've got about 11 people. I guess 10 of me, 10 of you. Let's just do a quick survey so I know you're all out there. Just write quickly, are you currently employed, still searching, or you have a job offer and haven't started yet? What's your category? So you've started your first job post Barnard, or you are still searching, or you have an offer but haven't started yet. Excellent. Okay, so we've got a couple people who haven't graduated yet but are working a job. Got some. So it looks like it's more people anticipating than people who have jumped right in and are currently working. So give me a couple of, let's do a couple scenarios, a couple dilemmas. Do you have something you're currently dealing with at work, or you've dealt with in the past, say in an internship or a job, just around this sort of general area of communication, etiquette, feeling out of step or confused by how things are done, mistakes you've made, insights you've figured out? Anybody want to share a scenario for us? I'll give you a second to think of yours. I'm going to go back to mine for a moment. And okay, so I'm just going to, instead of sharing my screen, I'll just read a scenario. All right, so here's the scenario. Think about this for a minute and then give a suggestion. Or as I said, you're welcome to. There's not very many of us, so I'm happy to have people unmute and share. So here's a what to do. You have received an assignment via email from your manager sent late last night. So first, you log on first thing in the morning, you've got an assignment in an email. You are unclear about what you're supposed to do. Your manager is extremely busy and not always reachable. What would you do? What's your advice? If somebody were in this scenario, or what would you do if you were in this scenario? You have an assignment, it's unclear, and you're not going to immediately be able to get to your manager for clarification. Feel free to unmute or type advice into the chat. Nice. So yeah, everyone seems to be putting it out to everyone, so that's great. You all can see this. So coworkers definitely seem to be a number one source, and this is a great. I think that's an excellent first step, or second step. I would say the first step is to definitely especially if you have any sort of emotional response to it, if you're feeling a little panicked, you might want to take a deep breath and reread it and see if you can jot down. It sometimes can help to do a quick little writing, here's what I think I'm supposed to do. Here's where I still have questions. So to break it down a little bit, and then even if your very next step is to reach out to coworkers, I think that's really helpful. So, and then again, working remotely, what are your options there? You could just forward the email quickly and say, not 100% sure what the first step would be on this. Any advice for me? Or how should I interpret this? You could hop on a quick chat. You could ask if somebody can hop on Zoom with you. There's a couple of different ways of doing that, even in a remote setting. But then at some point you do want to check in with your manager. I mean, if you get good advice from your coworkers and there seems to be a clear consensus, it's like, okay, but you might even while you're getting started on it with the advice from your coworkers, you might want to shoot a quick email to your manager, maybe at midday or mid-afternoon, and say, here's what I've done so far. I'm not 100% sure what to do on this. Please let me know by email, or if we could, talk for a few minutes between now and the end of the day, that would be helpful. So you don't want to go, I think the key with anything, whenever you're uncertain, you don't want to go too far down the road of guesswork and then have to sort of backtrack. So. And then one thing a particular highlight on this is that if the timeline is not clear, you always want to get that cleared up. And again, coworkers could be a good heads up on that, but you would want to double check that and say, when you give a progress report and say, oh, I got started on, this project that you assigned me this morning, and I'm about halfway through. I should be able to have it done by X, but I would need this and this from you in order to get that done. Please let me know if you need it sooner, or et cetera. So it's okay to be proactive, to sort of lay out a potential timeline to clarify that information. Great. Anybody else in the meantime thought of their own scenario that they want to share with us? Any dilemma they want to pose to us? Also, general questions about anything that we've talked about in the session today. We've got a few minutes left here, so feel free to unmute and ask a question, or type a question, give a scenario. All right, let's do another scenario of mine then. Oops, I repeated the same one twice. You were told that your office's workday was 9 to 5, but you noticed that most people arrive about 9:30, some as late as 9:45. So this is sort of in a physical workspace context, but you can think about this as well remotely, that it becomes clear to you that most people aren't online until about 9:30. Most meetings don't seem to start until later. So what should you do? When should you come in? So official word is 9 to 5, but informally, it seems like most people don't get there till about 9:30, and some come in even later than that. What would you do? Let's confine this to the beginning of the job at first. So it's your first 2 weeks. Excellent. 2 good pieces of advice. So one would be to keep coming in on time, especially as a new employee. So I think that's great, especially for the first couple of weeks. And use that time, to, work on things that are left from the previous day or things that you need to be working on an ongoing basis. It's actually, in a physical office, it can be kind of nice to be the person who's there early and alone. It's quiet. Yeah, so I would definitely err on that side in the beginning. But if it does seem to be, if it keeps going, it seems to be everybody, including your manager, that's not always there right on time. And especially if the correlation to that is people are also staying past 5, because that can be a norm as well, that, people don't show up till 9:30, but they're not leaving till 5:30 or 6 or even later, then it could be worth clarifying. So always, I think it's a good thing to, you can check informally with coworkers and colleagues, but it's helpful to clarify that with your manager. Again, it doesn't have to be the only thing you write the email about. You could tack it onto your first meeting or your second meeting, but it's helpful to get clarification. Great, okay. Let's do one more and then see if I can get you all to ask me any other questions. So the last one, so you just had something happen to you that has put you in a foul mood. You're very angry, very upset, but it's time to go to work. What do you do? So emotions are ruling, something terrible has happened, really upset you, but you got to be at work. Or you're supposed to be at work. What do you do? Lisa suggests listen to a meditation on the way to work and or communicate to my coworkers that I'm having a rough day when I arrive. I like both of those. If it's something that can be put on hold, and it's about sort of managing your emotions, getting into a different headspace so that you can work properly, I think meditation or other things you do to calm yourself down can be helpful. And then depending on your relationship with your coworkers, again, if you're brand new, this is a little bit trickier, but definitely, letting them know that you're not 100% yourself. Coffee, breathing, I like that. I do think the first steps here are to try and calm yourself down, get yourself into a focused, more positive space so that you can be professional and do your work. If that becomes impossible, right, because it's, it could be because of something very urgent or something that's so dominating your thoughts that you aren't able to focus, then you've got a couple of choices. You could, let somebody know, so that like colleagues or even your manager, so that they know that something's up, but there's nothing you can do about right at this moment, and that you're going to do the best you can. Or if you don't want to share that kind of information and sort of open up that conversation, you could think about whether it's possible to take a half day, come in an hour late. You obviously have to take a quick look at your schedule, make sure that there's nothing urgent, and, a quick email saying, again, you don't need to go into great detail. Something's come up, I will be there in an hour. And then if, and again, you're making this assessment, can you get yourself calmed down in an hour, or can you resolve whatever, if it's something a little bit more urgent. So, but communication is the key. On the late, it kind of circles back to the lateness thing. I was reading a particular advice of somebody was asking about coming in late, and there were 3 stages. There's you're barely late, so you just don't say anything. You're somewhat late, so you give a quick apology, maybe a super quick explanation. And then third is you need to email or text someone that you are delayed. And what was interesting was the advice varied. In some offices, the cutoff points were 2 minutes, 10 minutes, and half an hour. And in other places, the cutoffs was 15 minutes, no big deal, half an hour worth apologizing, hour So it kind of depends on your office and your home. And it could kind of be the same situation here where, just something comes up unexpectedly, and can you quickly take care of it and be a little bit late or duck out for a little while, or do you need to, officially take time off, more officially communicate it. Okay, we're right at 2:00. Any questions though? Things that we didn't get to, points I brought up that you weren't sure about? Well, thank you for joining in. Thank you for giving some advice and responses to the scenarios. Good luck with everything that's going on around you. It sounds like a lot of you are preparing you're still students, so you'll be coming back, most of you, to a semester one way or the other. Also, hopefully some of you will join the session next week as well as we complete the series. So take care, everybody, and feel free to follow up with me individually or with any of our team if you want to make a separate appointment. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.